Afternoon. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you. It's a full house. Thank you for coming and joining us for this event on advancing resilience measurement. I am going to be moderating the session, and I'm really pleased to have with us a great panel. You're going to hear some great stuff online and in person here. We have Chiara first up, then we have Leah, we have Kirk from Smithsonian, we have Nick, who's going to talk about the GRII, and we have Nate, who'll be doing the opening and the closing. There's been a slight change in our program. And we have the two Johns up on screen, John Mayer and John Choptiani, online, ready to talk about the resilience measurement approaches that they use. With that, I won't take much time. I'll hand over to Nate. Thank you. And thank you for coming here.
Be able to get the slides. So I'm pinch hitting on the opening due to a last minute change. So you have to forgive me if I look at the screen a little bit more, because these aren't my slides. It's the first time to see them. But I was involved in the event. So we're really excited to be launching, or not launching, but opening up this event on resilience measurement today. And you know, we see the push in the last couple of years around getting adaptation and resilience at an equal footing with mitigation, especially last year when climate impacts started to hit much more of the global north. Unfortunately, it took that sort of reckoning and awakening to see adaptation and resilience rise up the agenda. But for the majority world, they've been dealing with the challenges of climate impacts for many years. GRP has been working with a lot of partners in trying to advance resilience measurement over the last few years. And in May 2022, we brought together 60 experts from around the world to advance some principles and priorities on resilience measurement. And we really wanted these to be demand-driven, to focus on evidence, and I'll go through the principles in a second. But I'll mention this in my closing remarks as well, but really this is very much about a journey, and it's a long and complex journey. We know that with mitigation, it's pretty easy, right? It's net zero, it's pretty easy to measure, and it's very easy to communicate. Resilience is a more complex space. It's about engaging with systems, and it's about measuring systems and system change. And that is certainly not an easy thing. So we've started this journey in May. Well, we started it a few years ago. We also, a few years ago, brought together the resilience measurement, evaluation, and learning community of practice and took that from its inception with the Rockefeller Foundation and others and brought that into the Global Resilience Partnership and have been building out that community. And I'll mention this again in the closing, but next year we're going to have a much wider event with about 250 people. You're all invited, whether you can attend in person or online, on resilience, measurement, evidence, and learning. And just to emphasize again, these principles and priorities are so critical because as we see adaptation and resilience starting to go hand in hand with mitigation, the measurement is essential. And people are really trying to find their way there. So we're trying to be part of that community that brings people together to be able to develop more robust principles around measurement and evidence to ensure that the impacts and the investment actually provide the returns and the measurement, not just for the people who are delivering the investment, but also for the people on the ground. So I'll go through these principles pretty quickly. Suchi, how long do I have? 2 minutes, good. I'll be very quick. But you can also find these online on our report. So engaging with evidence users, obviously that being really critical, needing to engage with the communities. Different evidence users have different evidence needs. Some of these seem quite intuitive, but we really need to ensure that these are at the forefront of developing our measurement approaches and methods. And also the necessity of mixed methods approaches. Given, again, that we're dealing with the measurement of systems, this is absolutely critical. You need the mixed method approaches. It's the criticality of having a sort of diversity of approaches within resilience, and diversity being a key principle of resilience. And thinking about psychosocial well-being, so increasingly important, increasingly being recognized as important well-being outcome, and a condition that facilitates the improvement of others. The importance of culture and context within measurement and resilience. Measuring psychosocial resilience and well-being can be sensitive, though, and also recognizing that we have to follow no-harm principles when we're dealing with that. And then also thinking about well-being and other forms of resilience, so across different scales, individual, household, and across communities. And then in terms of systems resilience, as I mentioned about defining the systems, trying to put boundaries around it, and actually decide where you begin and end that evidence. But recognizing resilience is very much about dealing with the system. And really the objective is around these system level dynamics and understanding how these interact and intersect, not just across communities and households, but also across ecosystems, and where healthy biodiversity is key to all of that as well. The next one. Again, I'm just going to pick out a few highlights here, given I've got about minus 20 seconds. So again, on the climate and adaptation, the big focus on capacities that enable people, households, and communities to adapt and manage the impacts of climate change. And also, I would add in there, really, without compromising, so it says future well-being, but really about thinking about that transformational stage. You know, how are we finding those novel ways of stewarding ecosystems, novel ways of creating livelihoods? And there we go. So our full report and webinar up there, also on the GRP website. We're working really closely with University of Arizona. This was meant to be delivered by University of Arizona, hence the slides, but I'm the CEO of the Global Resilience Partnership, so I'm just jumping in here. But again, really welcoming all of you to join us on that partnership and that journey. Thanks.
Thanks, Nate. Very grateful that you jumped in. Right, so we're going to shift gears now and get into a conversation. So if I could get John Choptiani and John Mayer on the screen, please. Thank you. Hi. Right, so we have our 6 panelists here, and the format that we are going to follow is quick 2-minute opening reflections. We'll start with John Choptiani, and I might sneak in a question, a follow-up question based on what you say, but largely we'll then open into the audience questions and we'll keep the conversations flowing. I have a few backup questions, but I'd like as much as audience interaction as possible. Yeah, John, over to you.
Great, thanks very much for having me. Hope you can hear me okay. My name is John Choptiani. I'm the Acting Vice President of Global Initiatives, and I lead our climate resilience team as well at IDE. With resilience measurement, it's a very complex topic, and it's been studied for a number of years, but it's really only been the last 5 or maybe 10 years that it's really become to the forefront. There's a lot of considerations to consider. So one being, what are we doing the resilience of? What are we measuring? Is it the resilience of what to what and why? Why are we doing that? There's also a lot of different types of resilience. We can look at resilience in a very superficial way using an indicator like we measure the economy with GDP, and we can have a simplistic number, or we can look at the breadth of our systems. But like GDP, the systems we're looking at don't have well-defined boundaries, and even less so than GDP. So trying to understand where are the geographic boundaries, what are the thematic boundaries, recognizing that no one person is an island and completely self-sufficient. We rely on each other. So it's really looking at those relationships, the partnerships between people to measure the resilience. And doing this in a way that's hopefully as consistent as possible in order to be able to measure what's working and get the evidence in order to make our work really effective. So I think there's a lot to be done towards convergement, harmonization among tools, and really a shared understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then, of course, engaging all the people we're working with, we're measuring from, ensuring that it's a really participatory process. So I'm really excited to be here to discuss some of these things and see this system and resilience measurement evolve over time. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to sneak in a question about the Market Systems Resilience Index that you've been working on. Could you share some of the reflections and the early lessons that you've got from the field? I know you've been going to the field fairly frequently, so it would be good to hear some of your insights.
Yeah, happy to. So we've been measuring systems, market systems resilience for about 3 years now. The evolution of resilience usually started at the household level, but recognizing, again, as I said, it's all the interplay between people. We've been looking at the market systems resilience, and we've developed our market systems resilience index tool. We are using this in 7 countries across Africa and Asia. I just got back from Mozambique, where I was visiting some of the communities we're working with in northeastern Mozambique. And we use 11 different determinants of resilience. Again, you can simplify it into a single number, or you can look at all the different components. And I think it's important to do multiple levels. So we look at things, some standard or maybe obvious approaches, such as how does a person or a system measure up on redundancy or diversity or inclusion. And it's been really interesting to see, we look at the different market actors in a system, so the producers, the inputs, output suppliers, those, et cetera. And what we look at is we try to coordinate things like, do the market actors think that they're involving and having inclusion in integration and feedback loops with the producers that they're selling to? We ask similar questions at the producer level, saying, do you get access to these products? Are they tailored to you, particularly with systemically excluded groups? And that's been really interesting to find that people sometimes think they are doing this. And especially at the more local agro dealer side, there is some good evidence that they are working to make sure that they are reaching the last mile, but it's still pretty low. And then as soon as you go to the retailers and the higher levels, you're really seeing that they're really disconnected with the market, and that's creating both low resilience, but it's also an opportunity to better engage them. So that was really interesting to see how thin and weak the market was in Mozambique, especially in the north, that there's both there is that weakness, but also that there is a possibility to really engage and bring people there, and that there is a market that they could gain from. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, thanks. All right, so Nick, you've been working with the Global Risk Index Initiative, and it's almost a peek into the future, so it's kind of giving us a peek into the future. And I wanted to hear from you what you think about, what's your experience been like?
Thanks, Shuji. So maybe I should just explain what it is a little bit, because it's rather grandly titled, the program I'm working on, the Global Resilience Index Initiative, which is kind of a big name to live up to. The point of it, though, is kind of at the other end of the scale from what we've just heard, which is very much about individuals, about households and resilience at that level. This is a macro level view of resilience. And as we heard from Nate earlier, while it's relatively easy to manage issues around mitigation, around greenhouse gases, because we understand tons of carbon, there is no equivalent metric in adaptation and resilience. So a group of organizations, including the organization I'm with, which is the Insurance Development Forum, came together to try and fix that and use finance sector principles where the insurance sector has successfully managed risk and converted that to the movement of money for many decades. How about sharing that with the world and applying it to macro level flows? And let me talk about flows for a minute, because I've looked all around COP over the last few days, and one thing that really, really struck me was that basically all of us here are either trying to influence one of 3 flows, or we are influenced by them. One is carbon, one is water, and one is money. There's a lot of people who know a lot more about carbon than I do, who are of course, managing all of that. But let me just take the finance thing. This index, the idea of this index, is given the trillions of capital, and I'm not just talking about climate finance, and I'm not just talking about loss and damage, but the finance overall, given the trillions of capital there are around the world, how do you influence that capital so that it moves in more virtuous directions? And what you need to do that, you can't manage what you can't measure, so what you need for that is a measure, and that's what this index is all about. That was to start. You asked about the future. A key part of all of this is that the organizations involved have as a core capability an understanding of weather and climate, and are able to take future climate projections and model different scenarios, different exposures in the future, based on their understanding of the influence of different climate conditions. So it's, in that respect, you asked about our experience so far. Well, frankly, I'm afraid we're still at the demonstrator stage, so I can't talk to you too much about the experience so far, other than to go back to another point that Nate made, which is around evidence users. Absolutely critical thing that we're just doing at the moment is working with, for example, big financial institutions, working with governments, working with international regulators to understand, this being an unfamiliar area for them, what do they need to see from this tool that makes it usable, accessible, instinctive for them to use this and make better decisions on financial flows?
Right, thank you. Just one question that comes up in my mind is why global? What was your choice to go global? Because, I mean, instinctively when we think of resilience, we think of, like John pointed out, highly complex local systems and which are connected, but why global? Yeah.
Well, money is a little bit like water and a bit like carbon. It doesn't respect boundaries. So that would be a first thing, and we are, the organizations that we're not exclusively targeting, but we fail unless we serve them, are multinational organizations, whether they're on the public sector side or the private sector side. So it's absolutely critical that we're able to serve their interests, that, for example, they're able to compare risks on a consistent basis across boundaries. So it could be different hazards, different exposures, different geographies, but ultimately they've got to be able to prioritize and make decisions based on a good understanding of the resilience, the value of investing in resilience on an equal basis across these different assets, for example, globally. Yeah, and that's, I'd say that's probably, that was it. The other thought that I was going to say there was also they've got to understand the terrible cost of doing nothing. And that's the reciprocal, if you like, that's also important.
Thank you. Right. It's an interesting shift. You mentioned two things, flows that's centered around people and the fact that evidence users are important. And I think Leah has a bottom-up and completely complementary, possibly, approach to that. So Leah, I'm sorry, the mics have to be passed on.
No, that's fine. So my name is Leah Aoko. I'm from the Africa Research and Impact Network. We have worked closely under the Adaptation Research Alliance as a micro-grantee. We have also been involved in convening. We've had 3 workshops with the micro-grantees. So mine is really to bring into perspective the voices from the communities that we've been working with and how, when you speak about resilience, how success looks like for them. And one thing that has stood out for us is the need and emphasis on co-learning and co-sharing experiences, because these are the people who are at the center of this discussion. When we are talking about people in informal settlements, vulnerable groups such as women, children, youth, the elderly, persons with disabilities, how are they being resilient, right? So they inform the conversation and the work that we do. We have specifically worked in an informal settlement in Nairobi, Kenya, and we're looking at how those groups, social groups, are able to be resilient against, the adverse effects of climate change, such as flooding. And for us, really, it's giving them a voice at that perspective. It's giving them an opportunity to provide even solutions and to show you this is the roadmap. So resilience for them might mean, I used to do this as a livelihood, but I've had to change that. I used to engage in this activity socioeconomically, but that has to change, and to change to what? So really, when you're speaking about resilience, emphasis needs to be given to whom are you doing it for and for what purpose, and are you putting into perspective the correct voices and more the voices of those who are being affected by the discussion that we're having here. So I think just as a start, resilience really, when you're talking about measurement, it really points to we cannot do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So it's a tracker. I've appreciated his point, it's a tracker. You know, what can we do going into the future? Is it a pointer for something that we need to change? So that, I can say, from a community level, has really been insightful for us.
Sorry, we're adapting. We're resilient. Anyway, Kirk. Kirk here represents the Smithsonian Institute, and we've all been fascinated by the museum and fascinated by the institution itself. But the perspective of biodiversity is probably missing when we think about all the other measurement approaches that we've heard about until now. And we probably stop at the biophysical aspects of resilience measurement, but not necessarily the biodiversity. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, I feel the odd man out here because I'm thinking not about resilience in people and communities, but in ecosystems over time. I've spent, my definition of resilience is positive response to abrupt change. And I've spent my career, the last 35 years, studying what happened when the asteroid struck the planet 66.043 million years ago. It's a 10-kilometer asteroid. It was moving at 20 kilometers a second, so it took 5 seconds to pierce the atmosphere. And when it hit, it caused a catastrophe that basically caused global extinction of all animals larger than cats. So it was an instant global catastrophe. Yet there were survivors. And what we have from the fossil record is the ability to look at the past and the future of a past event. We can look at who was resilient, what kinds of organisms were resilient, why were they resilient to what is clearly the worst thing that's ever happened on the planet. It exceeds even what's going to happen with the worst case of global climate change because it was a direct impact from an asteroid body. Fortunately, we don't have too many more out there, but my second point is that museums are the memories of our culture. This is where we've preserved the objects, both of human cultures, but also biology that we've collected from around the world in the last 300 years. And in those museum collections lives the pasts and futures of previous landscapes. So we have the ability to look backwards and forwards, and since we know how the physical world has changed, we can look back in time and project and see what's going to happen in a warming climate, because we've seen it before. So paleontologists and museum people have seen our future, and it's just for us then to tap into the data that we have in the museum collections and help understand the future in the forward-going sense. And to that end, I would say that one other point, which is there are about 1,000 natural history museums in the world. We have yet to integrate and connect all of those museums into one global collection, because that's the tool we'll need to understand resilience in ecosystems moving forward. And we're well on that process. We're also developing new techniques, and I think one of the most useful one is the development of environmental DNA. The fact I can take a glass of water from the bay out there and extract 700 species. I can do that same test next week, and the week after, and the week after. So I can do biological assays on a regular basis in multiple places and see where the change is affecting local ecosystems. So this will obviously play into how people respond, but I think we're getting a good hand on some tools now that using museums and environmental DNA to start thinking about the future.
I have questions for you, but I'll come back to those. Chiara, maybe I'll pass on the mic to you. I'm mindful of time. Sorry.
Thank you. I cannot answer any question that you may have for Kurt, though. So, I mean, thanks again for, the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here with you and all the participants. I'm Chiara Trabacchi from British International Investment, BII for friends. British International Investment, for those of you who don't know it, is the UK development finance institution. It is an impact investor that has been very much, allocating patient and long-term capital in Africa, Asia, and more recently also in the Caribbean, very much to foster, private organizations to grow. So British International Investment has been working with a couple of initiatives over the past years, one of which is called the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative. The second is the so-called CIFAR, so Climate Innovation for Adaptation and Resilience Alliance. So the rationale for this has been very much coming together with peers, so other development finance institutions, but also with private investors and entrepreneurs to to address this hard to crack nut. I mean, it's a complex topic and we really need to come together to address it. We came together under the realization that the mispricing of physical climate risks and the mispricing of the benefits of climate adaptation and resilience have been hindering the allocation of private capital towards climate adaptation and resilience solutions. So this is very much an urgent issue that needs to be addressed, hence why we came together for, very much trying to develop an approach that is suited for private investors and financiers, including those operating in developing countries, such that to ensure that the measurement of climate adaptation and resilience benefits is very much catered to the need of the financing of such solutions through different investment avenues. And this is because private capital can and must flow to climate adaptation and resilience solutions through different forms, being through financial intermediaries, being through bonds, for instance, through project finance, etc. It is also relevant to consider that the measurement of climate adaptation and resilience needs to be applicable in the context of various types of transactions, being those that an investor undertakes to adapt existing activities to climate shocks and stress, for instance, like an infrastructure that needs to be resilient to flood, but also very much catering the needs of the measurement of the benefits associated with the financing of the so-called enabling solutions, those solutions that we need to provide access to others to enable them to adapt, such as climate risk analytics, for instance. And then it's very much also relevant to consider the use case. So how to very much integrate climate adaptation and resilience metrics through the investment process, because investors need to be able ex ante to determine what do I need to invest into and why it is relevant, and to prioritize investments, but also throughout the investment process to demonstrate impact over the life of the investment. Hence, there is work to be done. Great to have so many people with great brains with whom to collaborate. I stop here, but happy to clarify.
Thank you so much. Last but not the least, we have John Mayer from USAID. John, you have been in both in field and as a donor. Could you share your thoughts around measurement, how it's done, and how you see it now as a donor?
Thanks, Shruti. Happy to do that. Yes, John Meyer from the Center for Resilience at USAID Washington. I'm just going to share a few remarks on kind of where we are and where we need to go in terms of systems resilience measurement. Not too far back, 15, 20 years, we started talking about systems strengthening. And at that time, it meant perhaps training of health workers or ag extension agents. That's how we started. But I think there's a realization that those people are but a tiny part of the actual system. And we started building out our kind of knowledge of conceptual framework of the systems that they were a part of. And as we all, certainly USAID and others, started programming more in the resilience space, areas of recurrent crisis, with the understanding that it's not just helping people in need, but it's also building the systems that they depend on. Therefore, the interest in systems resilience as well. In my kind of awareness, the system that we've built out most thoroughly would be market systems. John spoke about that briefly earlier. I think if he had a longer time to present, you would have seen a very complex but brilliant framework of market system and what makes it resilient, structural aspects, behavioral aspects, really quite illuminating and building our awareness of just how these things work. I would say, from a USAID and a donor perspective, great start. It's almost in the realm of contextual research, we're able to understand the resilience of a system and possibly understand trends for that system, positive and negative. But I would say there's a important next step for a donor and for our implementing partners who, we're in the business of designing programs and making investments, and knowing that we can't do everything, have to make smart choices. So where are the leverage points? What are the factors or capacities or characteristics of the system that we need to invest in that are most important for strengthening the resilience of that system? And then how do we measure if our investment contributed to positive change? And I think we're very nascent in those areas. Positive change would be measured both in terms of the resilience of the system itself, but then how that system's resilience contributes to the resilience and well-being of the people that the system serves or that they're part of. So as complex as the system is, the measurement of it is maybe doubly so. And then, it's not just markets, obviously. We've been talking a lot about food systems, and food systems resilience need to follow the same pathway, understand the framework, figure out how to design programming and measure progress, health delivery, education. So it goes on and on. So just to sum up a bit, for USAID, we need to consider what investments and interventions are necessary in each context to build systems resilience, and then how to measure the success of our investments in programming. And that work really is just starting and will go on. So thank you.
Thanks, John. At this point, I'd like to open up to the audience. If there's any questions for any of the panelists? Yes. I'll come to you. If you could introduce yourself and...
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm Charles Tonui. I'm a researcher at the Africa Research and Impact Network. I work with Leah as a disaster risk policy analyst. And my key question, especially to the USAID representative, the data systems, especially in Africa, is still evolving. What are the kind of data systems or data sets that you are considering as donors that reflects the most vulnerable communities in Africa? Because that what we have looked at as fellows from ARIN across Africa is the challenge in terms of designing and implementing climate resilient focus programs. And when you look at the data set, they are quite scattered and it's not easy to really track the positive impact. That is why ARIN is bringing together the fellows to learn with the donors and also partners to really see how can we co-develop vibrant and engaging and inclusive data systems for Africa.
Thank you. You had a question here. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, hi. Colin from One Acre Fund. We do work with smallholder farmers, and we're trying to figure out how to measure resilience for smallholders. And one of the challenges we're facing is how to figure out the resilience threshold. So at what point does a household, or maybe community, if we need to go a little larger, spiral downwards beyond hope? So maybe this is a question for you, Leah, or maybe John. But we're literally trying to figure this out. So if anyone has a good answer, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you. Could we go to John Mayer first, and then maybe John Choptiani, and then Leah?
Thanks, Shruti. Yeah, I can respond a bit to Charles's question, and thank you for that. Yeah, a lot of the resilience measurement, I think, that has happened so far has been kind of from on high. Big studies designed and commissioned for researchers or consultants from outside. What you are aspiring to, I think, requires a slightly different approach. We're refining the idea of recurrent monitoring systems, which would be localized, use local enumerators. It's not a finished product, so much to be done yet. But the idea is that since resilience is most evident when a crisis is happening, so timeliness is critical. So to have on the ground data collectors, enumerators, researchers, what have you, who will be able to assess reactions from people, from businesses, from groups, etc., during and following a shock or a period of stress, to better understand how, their reactions, their behaviors, and changes in well-being for them, with an interest in to what extent any work that we've done with them, contributions we've made, whether that has helped. And again, this must involve local the local research community and on the ground researchers. Thanks.
Sorry, I had given off the mic. John Choptiani, if you could share your thoughts on Colin's question.
Yeah, happy to. So the short answer is we don't know. It's not an easy question or answer to know what the thresholds are when people start spiraling, but we are looking at that. So we work with smallholder farmers, but we're also looking at the markets that they interact with. And as I mentioned, we've been doing this in 7 countries, and we're starting to do it. Well, we are doing it annually. We are working with the University of Arizona to study this problem, and we're trying to gather as much data as reasonable as possible, so that we can look at big data sets and understand where there are lessons learned. And I think one of the key things, there's 2 main reasons why you would want to measure resilience. One is to track things, to see how things are going over time, are things improving or not. But one of the biggest things, and the things that excites me the most, is looking at what we can do with the data. So measuring in different contexts what's actually working and what's not, and can we have a somewhat loose recommendation system? So can we say you have a low resilience in this determinant, this indicator, this component of resilience, therefore this is what you could try. And it's important not to be prescriptive and say, if you have this problem, you must do this and it will fix everything. But as we're getting more and more data, we want to be able to tease out what's working and what's not. And the flip side of that is what's not working, and then thus what is a spiral, what's the threshold of not good enough. And of course, this becomes quite complicated when you have so many different groups. You can slice the data in totally different demographics, livelihoods, locations, etc., and trying to understand what are the sort of truths, what are the standards across contexts, across years, to be able to understand what are those things, what are the key attributes you can do. And we're using this in our program design and also evaluations to make sure that when you go into a community, you know that water's an issue, for example, but is the water access an issue for everybody? Is it for just certain types of people? Is it certain locations? Is the issue that you need more wells, or are there actually wells there, but they're not working? Is there a way that you can actually have productive use of that water? So it's all those intricacies that can be lost if you use a fairly simplistic measurement. So all that being said, we don't know, but that's where we're excited to be looking at what makes things worse and what things can make things better, and measuring that. So we're hoping by engaging with others that we'll build this data set across as many countries as possible and have a relatively consistent approach. Obviously, there's trade-off with balancing contextualization and adaptability to context versus standardization and comparing across contexts. But really studying those questions, because that over time will then give us some of the answers on how we can do programming better. So happy to discuss that further, probably at a different time. But thank you.
Leah, your reflections now.
Yeah, I think what is working for us as RN in the informal settlements is really a co-produced assessment approach to heterogeneous communities. So basically, we are co-identifying the metrics in guiding what would be the threshold. So for a family, it could be putting food on the table. For another family, it could be ensuring that the children are going to school despite the weather. So it really depends on what type of group you're dealing with. When you have highly socialized environments where there are vulnerable groups, then that would also, inform the metrics that we are working with. So for us, it's really the having an environment of co-sharing, co-learning, and just co-producing all these metrics and indicators in the context of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, or I have a few. Right, okay. We have a few here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Veronica Jor from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. And so Australian researchers have been working on resilience for a long time. And one of the key things that we think is really different about it in a context of climate change is that, we can't fully predict the impacts of climate change. We can't fully predict, the degree to which we're all going to mitigate or how fast. And so generalized resilience or systemic resilience becomes really important rather than specified resilience. And so to us, that means resilience is actually about capacities and processes for ongoing change rather than kind of specific indicators of what you have right now. I know in an event like this, we don't get to go very deep into what you're working on, but I'd really like to hear a little bit more about whether some of your indicators are actually about those processes and capacities.
Hi, Santiago Enriquez from Apt Associates. I wonder if you could talk about how you incorporate time dimensions into this. How do you sort of consider whether maybe like a short-term adaptation action is actually maladaptation over the long term, maybe linking to that uncertain future? But also, how do you assess maybe the trade-offs between communities that have very urgent needs today versus maybe investing in longer-term resilience? And even, how quickly can you measure those changes to see if you're sort of going in the right direction or not? Even from the USAID perspective, how do you, assess what's the direction of the magnitude of change that you would ideally achieve over 5 years, as opposed to maybe longer-term resilience in communities? Thank you.
Thanks. John, do you want to go first? John Choptiani, sorry.
Sure, happy to. Am I able to share my screen quickly?
Yeah.
Great. I will do that very quickly, just so you can see some of the indicators that we're using. That might make it a bit more actionable. So we measure things at the principal level, so structure, connectivity, support, environment, and financial of the market. We also break this down into the determinants, so redundancy, diversity, functionality, inclusion, integration, collaboration, feedback loops, enabling environment, preparedness, physical environment, and financial viability. We then further break that down into indicators, and then we further break that down into questions. So at the end of the day, this is a survey that we ask of people. And you can see there's different components here. We're trying not to be too prescriptive in saying one is more important than the other, but we do see things like financial viability is really key. If people aren't making enough money, they stop doing what they're doing. If there's not good inclusion, that is terrible, but it's not necessarily more acute. So what we look at is both the short-term and the longer-term resilience components. And that makes a bigger difference over time. We're doing the measurement at an annual time series, so that we'll see things over time, and we're looking at those changes. Some of these are sort of more on the process side, so particularly the feedback loops. Are people able to share their feedback to the market actors and vice versa, so that there is a change over time. We don't have the necessarily like all those processes articulated, so I'd be very happy to discuss further. We recognize that there's no perfect way of measuring resilience, but we're always trying to improve this over time and looking at the data of how we can improve it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Nick, are you interested in responding?
So I was really interested in your question. Thank you so much for asking it. Because what we're talking about here is uncertainty and treatment of uncertainty. And I love the approach that you're thinking of there around looking at capacity and processes. There's huge danger in taking a snapshot in time and relying on that. And we know that that only helps you in the immediate future. It's not going to, particularly when it comes to the movement of large amounts of finance. And changes, for example, in infrastructure, we need to be thinking much longer term, and we need to be changing and evolving our assumptions as we go along. So we need to be capable of doing that. So I'll mention this thing we're working on, the Global Resilience Index. The point is to try and create a movement that is capable of constantly ingesting, constantly sensing new data, but also just new methodologies, new ideas about, particularly, for example, systems, and we've heard a bit about systems, networks, such as infrastructure networks, such as supply chains, and the interaction there with impacts on things like health and food security and more. So there is no good answer other than, I think you're right, it's a process approach. It's this thing has to be a living thing, constantly questioning its own assumptions, completely understanding there's no such thing as a correct model or total certainty, but aiming at least to reduce uncertainty. And if it's capable of doing that, then at least it's developed debate, it's developed sharing, it's developed hopefully using a common language of risk. It's brought together organizations that wouldn't otherwise be talking to each other about these capabilities, about these processes.
Thank you. I think Leah might have some thoughts on processes as well, about co-creation.
Really, it's just a reiteration of the need to involve the voices on the ground. They need to put their vital interests at the center of this conversation, because a win-win situation may not always be the result or the outcome, but really in the context of resilience, we need to voice out the vulnerable groups and their positions and how they feel this should be tracked and how the indicators, should be measured. Yeah.
I mean, the question about capacities and processes, I think, is very much key, particularly in the context of private investing. I mean, if I'm providing capital to a fund manager, to a local financial institution, such that for it to reach the farmers on the ground, what I need to make sure is that I develop the capabilities, I support the development of capabilities within financial intermediaries, such that for them to understand and measure the risks to which their portfolios may be exposed and vulnerable to support them in developing products that can finance, the solutions that the farmers need, and for them to understand what do they need to measure very much to understand the chain and price in the benefits of. So capabilities and processes is key in the context of the long chain that can occur in the investment decision making and processes.
Thank you. John, before we go back to you, John Mayer, Kirk, I have a question for you. I mean, this does seem like a conversation that's happening that may be way different from the conversations you may be having. But do you see any entry points into collaboration? Because at the end of the day, climate change and biodiversity loss are two sides of the same coin.
That's a really good point. And the Australian example really stood out to me because I think that we do develop some predictability in specific biomes, and communities live in biomes. So there's some local ecological knowledge that will give us certain amount of predictability. You can target your resilience planning in certain conditions. And climate change is global, but it's also manifest locally. There's some places that will repeatedly flood. There's some places we have repeated droughts. So I think to keep those things in frame and kind of break this huge problem into maybe not a lot of pieces, but enough sort of regional frames that are tied to the impacts of change that might be valuable.
Thank you. And John Mayer, your thoughts on the question on maladaptation and dynamics?
Very interesting stuff. I was taken by the comment from the participant from Australia. There's a certain arrogance, I guess, of predicting the future. That's probably beyond our means to do with any great precision, and particularly with let's say a community of farmers dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So it's not our job to predict what the future will look like and then plan for that. It's our job to help those folks deal with a unpredictable future and expanding options and building their kind of human capacity for making informed choices based on the realities that fall upon them. The second question, dealing with timeframes, I thought was very pertinent as well. In the development world, we're used to the 3 to 5 year project, and measurement starts at the beginning and ends at the end. But climate change, as quickly as it's going, is still a much longer term proposition. So, here in our group, there's some modeling work going on, trying to estimate 20 plus years out the impacts of policy decisions or strategy choices that we might make, and the impacts they would hold for the communities we serve. Tricky business, and a model is only as good as the data that is used to create it, and I think that a lot of that is as yet unavailable. So a work in progress. Thanks.
Sorry, we don't have time for a question. I'm very sorry, but we can continue conversations later. As Nate said, it's a journey. With that, I invite Nate to give closing remarks. Unfortunately, we're tight on time.
Thank you so much, Suchi, and thank you to all the panelists as well. So I'm just going to take you through 1 minute of closing remarks, and I want to cover 4 quick points. So it's around journey, importance, challenge, and then invitation. So again, as Suchi just mentioned, and we kicked this off on, it is very much a journey. And I have to say a particular thanks to USAID as well for really supporting us on this. They're a real leading light within the donor community on looking at the different complexities of resilience measurement. And it is, next when I talk about the challenge, it's really this, it's importance that's next. So the importance again is we see this investment driving in this need to get to grips with how we measure resilience is never been more important. We've got the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, the global goal on adaptation, the race to resilience, the lot of funding flowing in here from the public and private sector. So we need to grapple this and do it together. Importance then challenge. Yeah, we still have a lot of challenges in doing this. You can see the diversity of perspectives here on the panel. And it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight, but to get through a complex journey, we have to do that together and with a diversity of actors and perspectives. And we certainly leads me into invitation, that we want all of you to be a part of that with us. So we're a partnership. We want to bring more people into this partnership of advancing resilience measurement. And so really would like to encourage you to sign up to the Resilience Knowledge Coalition, which currently has about 500 members, where we're sharing best practice on resilience measurement. and implementation. And you can find that on our website, and Suchi is leading that, which is fantastic. And then also to really attend our events. We'll keep them live streamed if you can't make it in person, including the Resilience Evidence Measurement and Learning Forum next year, which we're running in support with USAID. So it just leaves me to say thank you again to all the panelists and Suchi for the fantastic moderation.